Right, let's get started. I'm Erik Johnson. I'm a core engineer. Been contributing for a little bit over 3 years. Been a SaltStack employee for about a year and a half. Show of hands, who here has used a file server backend other than the default? All right, how many of those have used Git? Anybody use the Git backend, not the Git CLI tool? How many have used the Mercurial backend? Goose egg. All right. Has anybody used MinionFS? Okay. So that's good. That means there's some people here. People here will actually be able to learn some new things today. So I'm going to talk to you about the different file server backends, what they do, and how they work, and how you can use multiple backends. So the file server, the SaltStack Salt file server, it by default when we first started, it just deployed files from the master's local file system. So in version 0.14, it was expanded, and as of that version and later, now has a pluggable architecture. So you can write your own file server as long as you want. I mean, as long as you satisfy just a few basic core functionalities like listing files, retrieving files, listing directories, etc. So for backends where Salt needs to get files from external sources, such as the version control system backends like GitFS, Mercurial, etc. What it'll do is it'll fetch those repositories to the master, so the minions don't have to actually touch those repositories. The masters will fetch them and provide them just as files to be deployed to the minions. So that reduces the amount of times you're hitting your repository, and it also allows you to sometimes to deploy files to where into certain architectures where maybe your minions may not be able to get out to some external server. A little bit later we'll be talking about environments. I'm not going to touch on them right now, but environments allow you to have multiple distinct file trees that you can maintain separately, this sort of fulfills that dev to QA to prod workflow. So this, I believe, is all we have right now. I may have left one out. I'm not sure. So we have ones based on, like I mentioned before, Git, Mercurial. We also have one for S3. It can pull data from S3 buckets. There's also MinionFS, which I briefly mentioned earlier. What that allows you to do has anybody ever used the cp.push function? So cp.push, it's not something that you can do it's not something that's enabled by default. You actually have to turn on a parameter in the master config file. What that lets you do is take files from the minion, push them up to the master where they'll sit in the master's cache directory. Now we originally kind of envisioned that as just a way for minions to just push files up to the master so they could be retrieved later. But it turned out to be pretty easy to just turn that into a backend, and what that allows you to do then is push files from one minion that suddenly just becomes servable to your entire infrastructure. So I'll demo MinionFS a little bit as well later on. So to start out, I'm just going to do a real brief demo with just GitFS. So that's enabled by turning on the Git line here in the file server backend. And restarting the master. Just waiting for the minion to reauth to the restarted master now. There we go. So There's how many of you have used runners before? How many are familiar with runners? So we have so runners are tools that can be used from the master, and those fit that kind of fits the file server because you don't want to tell 20 minions to list every file that's on the file server. You can just query the master, and that's what runners are for. So we're going to do salt run file server dot file list, and we should have just a single file there. I just created a couple repositories. And they're both sitting here on my laptop because I didn't want to tempt the Wi-Fi here. And if you look at, so you can see we have, I'm actually in the dev branch right now, so. You can see the same files there as in this second repository. And we should probably also look at the configuration. So here we have our two remotes, both the GitFS 1 and GitFS 2. Now you notice they both have this. Actually, that's the dev environment on that one too. So you notice they both have this foo.txt. Yes. I prefer PyGit 2. It's not, and I can go over those, the different ones in a moment. PyGit 2, in my experience, it's quicker. It uses less resources, and it also is the only one that happens to support key-based authentication without having to do like a Git config file. Yeah, it still requires a fairly new version. I think you can get it for Red Hat in EPEL. You can get it on. You may or may not be able to get it on 1404 LTS. Yeah, so failing that, I would say that Git Python is probably a little bit more well vetted than Dulwich. So what he was asking, we actually provide more than one way of accessing GitFS because there's multiple Python interfaces to Git. By default, by default we used to default to Git Python. Now, if you have both Git Python and PyGit 2, and you don't tell Salt which one you want, it will choose PyGit 2. But if you install any one of those and you don't tell it which one you want, it'll be smart enough to pick the first one that it finds. So going back here, you notice when I did a file list, okay. When I did a file list here, I only got that one file. This file was in both repositories. So how does Salt pick which one that it's going to use? The answer is that it searches each of these repositories in order. So if we go back to the configuration, you notice we had GitFS 1 and GitFS 2 repositories, so listed in that order. So that means that the file, that foo.txt would actually be sourced from GitFS 1 instead of GitFS 2. Typically, we don't find this to be an issue that people run into that often. They typically will architect their file server in such a way that they don't have these kind of collisions. But it's helpful to know it's helpful to know what will happen when these collisions do happen. So deploying a file can be done using a simple file.manage state. And I'm going to use a function called state.single. It allows me to run a single state without having to create an SLS file first. And you can see it actually looked like there was already a file called foo.txt in /temp. So, because we're seeing a diff here, looks like it was an empty file. Now let's say I were to go into here and comment out the first repository, or instead of commenting out, or if I just let's say I just reverse their positions. Now as I restart the master. Make sure we're auth back. If I rerun this now, you're going to see it redeploy with a diff that says this is the second repository. That was the file from the GitFS 2 repository. So again, this is all showing you how it handles those collisions. It basically squashes all files into a single virtual file system, and then from that file system, we'll deploy the first matching file based on the order of the sources and also the order of the backends. So that's a very quick demo of GitFS. We have a walkthrough on docs.saltstack.com. That's a lot more in depth, and I recommend you check that out. So you can also, as you might have seen in my config example, you can have more than one backend. And so you can mix the roots backend, which is the default backend, with Git or Mercurial or Subversion or all of them. So the one thing that you need to make sure that you're aware of are, again, those merging rules that I mentioned earlier. So let's say I also had a foo.txt in the root of my roots file server, and that was above the Git file server in my file server backend list. Then it wouldn't even look in Git. It would grab it out of roots. That's the gist of the file server file path merging. And so now we'll move on to environments. Environments are, to be honest, we don't have. I would say the majority of people don't use different environments. They're probably just content using the base environment. But there are use cases such as deploying like web apps that go from dev to QA to prod, where this can be very helpful. As I mentioned before, Git branches and tags, or I may not have mentioned it before. That may be on the next slide. Yes, it is. So Git branches and tags map to environments. So that means if you have a dev branch, that becomes the dev file server environment. If you have a QA branch, that becomes the QA file server environment. By default, the master branch is going to be the base environment, because that's the default environment that Salt uses. So it's going to use master. You can change that either globally or on a per repository basis. Mercurial works in much the same way. It uses branches, bookmarks, and tags, and then uses of course the default branch becomes base. That can also be configured to match your particular repository. The idea is we want to match your repository, not force you to design your repository around how you use Salt. Subversion, the Subversion backend is a little bit more restrictive. You have to have your repository laid out with the three directories all at the root. I've seen, to be honest, I've never seen anybody not do it that way, but apparently they do. And the base environment is non-configurable. It's always going to be trunk in Subversion. S3, there's actually two different ways of doing S3 environment, like determining what becomes an environment. You can either have one bucket per environment, or you could have buckets based on the path within the environment. There's an explanation in the S3 file server documentation that shows how you would configure that in your master config to do it both ways. And then minionfs, as I mentioned before, the minionfs will default to base. You'd have to specify your own environment using the minionfs env parameter in the master config file if you want to make it somewhere other than base. Also, by default, minionfs is going to serve these files out from the root of the file server, so it'll start with the minion ID, and then follow it by the path on that, the relative path to the root where that file was before it was pushed. That's going to be the actual Salt file server path. So, for instance, if you had a minion named CentOS, and you had a file in /temp/foo.txt, then the default file server path for that, if you enabled minionfs, would be salt://CentOS, the minion ID, followed by /temp/foo.txt. There are options where you can tell it where you want it to start. We call that a mount point, so you could actually move that stuff to a separate, like have that stuff appear further on down the Salt file server architecture. And you can also, of course, just move it out of the base environment altogether, so that if you're deploying files from there, you're explicitly saying you want to deploy it from the environment where the minionfs files are. There's really no singular right way of doing it. So now I'm going to do a demo of using multiple backends. I'm going to re-enable those ones I had in my master config file. While I'm getting this ready, does anybody? I don't really have very many slides left. So does anybody have any questions?
So I noticed in your configuration you had a file URL to your backend.
Yes.
You can also use an actual connection with it remote.
Yes.
This is just because
The file URL is just because of the crappy Wi-Fi.
I was actually going to use crappy Wi-Fi.
Yeah. No. You can use HTTPS. You can use the Git protocol, but not on every provider. I'm not sure. But
Do you have recommendations on keeping that up to date? I mean, do you just use cron or something? Do people do it that way?
keeping what up to date?
Keeping your Git repo locally up to date.
Well, so what will happen is, and that's actually a good question because I completely forgot to mention that. So every 60 seconds, there's a dedicated thread in the Salt master that will wake up and it'll do maintenance things. It'll clear out jobs that are past their retention time, and it'll update all the file server backends. And then it'll go to sleep for a certain number of seconds, by default 60 seconds. And as part of this maintenance loop, right, that runs in its own dedicated thread, all of the configured backends are updated. So by default, you're going to get about every minute. The copies of your repositories are going to be updated on the master.
So even if you're using this local.
Yes, because it's not actually going into there. It's actually making its own copy. So it's actually cloning that copy basically.
It's following the remote up to the master.
Yeah. Don't confuse this with like the actual location where it's pulling the files. It's actually making a copy of the Git repositories objects in a location within the master cache directory. So that means that a remote repository, it's just going to fetch every time. It's just running a fetch. But in this case, in this case, the Git remote it's fetching on is a file URL, but it's not. But the place from which the files are like compiled and deployed is within the master cache directory, and that goes for all of the remote revision control backends. They operate in pretty much the same way. So I'm going to go ahead and enable. Actually, I'm going to leave roots for now, and I'm going to enable Mercurial and then MinionFS. And let's take a look at the configuration I have for those remotes. If you notice I'm doing the same thing with Mercurial also because I don't want to have to go out to another outside web server. You see this here, what I was mentioning before about mount pointing or mount points for your remotes or for your backends. What these allow you to do, and these were added, I believe, in I want to say 2014.7.0. They allow you to decide where the files from these sources are actually made available on the Salt file server. We had gotten a lot of complaints from people that they were having to make new repositories and like rearrange their repositories because they didn't want to. They were getting files colliding with others and it wasn't organized very well. And so by using a mount point, then the root of your repository would be under salt foo bar, and that allows you to organize your salt configuration around your existing revision control infrastructure. Now, what you can do with these mount point values and a bunch of other values that you use to configure Git, Mercurial, Subversion, etc., is you can actually do what are called per remote or basically per repository configurations. So if I wanted to, I could gotta put a colon there to tell it that it's got another that it's got additional configuration under it. I could say mount point. Basically, you would take the whatever fs underscore and remove it from the beginning, and then I could say, and I could make just one repository appear at a different mount point. So the way it works is that the global version applies to everything, and then those can be overridden. So if you have a sane default that you don't want to have to do, for every repository, then you can put that as the global option and then override it on the repos that don't follow that need. Mercurial, HG being the command line, and the elemental symbol for element symbol for Mercury. And here I have a configuration issue. It thinks that I have a per remote configuration because I have a trailing colon. See, I did this on purpose. It's not an accident at all. So if I remove that now, it should actually work. Okay. And if I run actually before I start doing anything, let's take a look at those repositories. So I just have one file in there. Again, I wanted this to be just sort of a demonstration of how things work, and didn't want the examples to be too complicated. Now, looking at this, looking at that one file there, and then knowing that we have the foo.txt in the other, we should expect now to see multiple files in the file list. So now we have the additional file there. You notice that we enabled MinionFS, but you don't see any MinionFS files there. Well, number one, that's because I haven't pushed any, which we can do shortly. Number two, you'll notice that I set the minifs env. I find that whenever I do need to use minifs, I like to keep the files in their own environment because I rarely ever need to use them to deploy them anywhere, and it's just nice to keep it kind of sort of segmented off so that if I needed to deploy it, I just choose to deploy from the minifs environment. So the important thing to note is that to do a cp.push, you do have to have this enabled in your master config file. If you do, if you have it, if you don't have it enabled on your master config file, I believe the minion will still try to push it, and it won't know that it failed, and it'll say true, and you'll think that it's there, but it's not, and you won't know unless you look at the master. Master will log that a file was attempted to be pushed to it, and that this option wasn't turned on for security reasons. We don't allow files to be pushed back up to the master by default. So just a word of warning: if you do try to push it from the minion, it will say true even if the file was refused on the master side. So I'm just going to create a file here in temp. And then I'm going to do a cp.push temp SaltConf15.txt. And it says true. And now what we're going to do is we're going to tell it to update all the file server backends that it's got. Again, this will happen naturally on a cycle, but if you want to see it right away, this is the way to do it. So now we're going to list the files again, and you're going to see again. We don't have it available here because it's in a different environment. The way we specify a different environment is with saltenv. And we can see that it's again, we can see that the beginning I used a mount point here saying that I wanted the files to appear at salt minifs. So looking back at the list, we can see it starts with minifs, the minion name, and then the relative path to the file. So if I wanted to now, I could do I could deploy that using I'll deploy it again with a state.single. And it's actually already on that directory, so I'm just going to call it new saltconf.txt. And you can see we created a new file. Oops. And it's really it's the same file. We just sort of deployed it back to the same folder it was in. So that's minifs. You'll notice now that let's see, where's I at? Oh yes, environments. That was the whole reason for this as well, is to show both multiple backends and multiple environments. So the Git repositories I have, they also have development branches or dev branches. So if I were to deploy a file from there, the same file, but let's choose saltenv of dev. Remember, it's already got a file there that says that's from the second repository, is because we disabled the first repository earlier. So you'll see the diff now is removing that line and replacing basically the entire file with a file saying that it's from the dev branch. Again, if we were to look at the repository, and this would be the master version of that. And then that's the file that was deployed. Again, this file, if it existed in the second repository, it would be ignored because it was found first based on the ordering in which the repositories appeared in the configuration. So, does anybody have any more questions about the multiple backends and environments? It's Actually, I have no more slides except for Q&A, so I guess it's all questions from here on out. So, yes? Yeah, so the top file, the way it was supposed to work, so there's documentation on how it's supposed to work and the order in which it's supposed to work, and apparently the behavior has changed. There's actually an open bug about that, that it's supposed to basically start at the base environment unless you specify an environment. Then it's supposed to look in that environment, but then it could still be overridden if it's in the base environment. And there's a whole bunch of rules that govern how top files are compiled, and those were laid out in the docs, but those docs are unfortunately not accurate as of right now. What I found now you were using GitFS, and you were and so when you were running like a high state, or were you running like a state.top or what?
Yeah, so different high states.
Yeah. What should happen is that you should have each environment, if each environment has a top file, only with its own environment defined within it. What should happen is when you say state.high state with a salt env of dev, should pull the top file from the dev environment, look for a dev section in that top file, and then process it. And did you have that same environment defined in top files in other Git branches? Okay, that probably is what happened, and that's just part of the rules of how they're compiled, and I can't remember them off the top of my head because it's honestly really complicated and shouldn't be. What I've seen work best. Now you said you have to do completely different actions, completely different states based on environment. Okay, yeah. What I've seen that tends to work best is having all of that. Having all of the it tends to work better when you don't have different states to execute in every environment. But what I've seen people do and have success with is maintaining the top file only in the base environment. That technically actually should work better for you. If you define all of your all of your environments and all your top file, or all of your all of your high state, all of your states, and all of your matching in the top file, so like a dev stanza in the top file of your master or branch, you may see some better behavior. But given that there's an open bug against how the top files are compiled, I can't with 100% certainty say that that's what's going to happen. But I'd love to take a look at it and try to figure it out. Yeah. Yes. Yes, the cp.push does support binary files. I think it treats every file. It just it sends it over the I don't know if it's it sends it over the same bus that it actually uses to respond and send return data back to the master. So it's always just broken into there's a file buffer limit, which I believe is something like I think it's 256K or is it? I think it might be. I don't quote me on that, but I think it's about 256K is the buffer size, and any bigger than that, it'll be broken up into multiple chunks and sent separately. So and then it's all deserialized on the other end, or decrypted and deserialized on the other end, and then pieced back together. No, not. There's only there's no limit that's programmed into it. It's just there's just that buffer size, so there's a chunk size basically. So you could transmit like a 700 megabyte Linux ISO or something like that. It just may take a few minutes. SaltConf15, I believe is the same. I'd have to take a look. It's been a while since I've touched that any of that code, so it's not as present in my memory. But it would be easy enough if I were to look at the code. I could clear that up for you if you want to see me after. Any other questions? If we have no other questions, that we are about 10 minutes early. I think it's pretty late in the day. If everybody wants to leave and go get something for dinner, yes. Yeah. So formulas, they're not necessarily designed. We strongly recommend against using formulas from from GitHub because they can be changed out from under you, and yeah. So you definitely would want to, if you want to use them, we recommend kind of using those as a starting point. And keep in mind also, a lot of these formulas install packages, right? So if you're looking to optimize things, if a bunch of formulas have different pkg.install states or pkg.installed states, that means that it's making a separate call to the package manager every time. So there are ways of optimizing it as well. Yeah. Okay. But as such, we don't really have any. This is the best way to do it. We have a couple of our engineers are working on some sort of like good best practices on the things that'll work for the majority of simple cases, and that'll give you a good foundation on which to build. Yeah. So we're working on those type of examples right now. There is also an example of using the roots backend, the default file server backend, how to implement a dev to QA to prod workflow, and that takes advantage of the ability for the roots backend to have multiple roots per environment. So what you could actually let me bring that up right now. May not apply if you want to source this. If you want to source this from Git, it wouldn't apply. You'd have to have these in different branches and merge forward. But let's see. Oh. Not what I wanted. Oh, it's tutorial, that's probably why. So let me bring the text size up. So the if you look at this, this shows you that the base just has the stuff in prod. QA has the stuff in QA, but like QA will supersede prod, and with dev supersedes QA and supersedes prod. So in this way, this is the way to do it on file routes. This is one way to implement that as a implement that type of workflow. With a version control backend, you'd have to have separate branches and make the change at the lowest branch first, the dev first, and then merge forward to QA, merge forward to prod, to achieve the same workflow. This is basically it as far as kind of like use cases for manipulating environments for your workflow. We don't currently have anything else because everybody's use case is different, and trying to find a good general best use case has been kind of tricky for us. So. You mean having a local checkout and then having a post install hook or a post update hook kick off a like a fetch or something like that, or? I don't think we yet have anything for GitHub externally to trigger the master to create because that would need to do so we would need to have a salt event for it to react to. I can't think of a good way to do it off the top of my head without salt managing it right now. Although I'm sure there are ways, I just don't have them none spring to mind right now. I'm sure I could come up with something if I needed to. What we actually used to do at my old job is we would have the Git post receive or post update. I forget. I think it's PostReceiveHook, obviously, because so the PostReceiveHook would fire an event, and then we'd have a react. It would fire an event that's saying that this repository had been updated, and then we would have a reactor on the master that would do things like update the file server and then like immediately update the file server and then kick off a deploy. So that we use that to keep from having to deploy 5 times a day to dev. We use that to sort of keep stuff up to date. So that's one way of doing it with Salt. Well, this assumes that the Git server is a minion and can fire events on the. Yeah. Exactly, and so we don't have anything yet that ties into Git that allows you to do that. Some of the new subsystems that. Yeah. Yes. So pillar data is actually maintained separate from the file server. By default, like all of your pillar data is in its own separate file routes. We just call it pillar routes. Then we have a number of external pillar interfaces, like external pillar modules, we call it, that you can enable with something called ext_pillar. These are separate Python modules, so they don't have all the same features as GitFS. Not yet. They should by another 1 or 2 feature releases. Those are slated for a refresh. But Pillar differs from the file server in that while you can have environments in Pillar, they don't really matter. They're more for organization, because when you compile Pillar, you get a single dictionary of Pillar data. You don't have Pillar in file server environments in the way that you do Salt file server environments. You can create separate environments in Pillar, but they're all going to be evaluated separately and then combined into a single dictionary. Yes. Access control in what way? So right now, any files that are exposed can be deployed to any minion. As far as minionfs, there is access control for minionfs. Let's say you might use cp.push on a number of boxes, but you only want to make the files from these 2 or 3 boxes exposed via minionfs. There's a whitelist, blacklist parameter that we use for that. Let me see if I can bring it up here, if I have it configured. Yeah, so this will match any minion starting with Salt. So if I had another minion that was attached to this master that pushed files to it, and it didn't match that expression, then its files would not show up and would not be able to be served via minionfs. So I know it's not exactly what you asked, but it gave me the opportunity to mention the fact that we have some limitations on what minionfs files are served. What's that? What kind of files? Okay. The best way of doing that would be to store them in Pillar. As far as keeping binary files, that might be a bit tricky. I mean, yeah, I guess you could do that with Git with the Git external Pillar, but Git's not really made for binary files. But the Pillar data is only ever compiled in the master, so it's never on the minion stored anywhere to be snooped on by somebody, and so that's what we recommend for deploying things like SSH keys and stuff like that. And maybe there is a way that I'm just not aware of yet to reliably to deploy binary files through Pillar. If there is, I'm not aware of it yet. But yeah, the answer is anything sensitive should be deployed via Pillar, because it never persists anywhere on the minion. It's compiled it's compiled when it's needed, and then it may be cached briefly on the master, and that's it. Okay, looks like we're slightly over time. If we have any more questions, I could try to get to them. But otherwise, you guys can go get something to eat, because I know I will.
I got a question. Okay. I just wanted to verify the point you made earlier about Pillar environments.
Okay.
I have my formulas separated out. There are some that
Yeah.
what you have, and I also do the same thing on Pillar environments. But are you saying when I run Salt SaltStack and give it in for the environment and say use div, that it uses my Salt formulas for div?
Yes.
Just go to the portions that will give.
Correct. Well, it just runs a compile Pillar, and maybe I'm wrong about this. That's just the way I understand it. I could run a couple tests and yeah. As far as I know, that's the way it works, but I could be mistaken. So I'm much more knowledgeable about the file server than how Pillar works. so there's definitely a possibility I'm wrong about that. I'd be happy to look into it real quick right here with you before, so we can get an answer to that. Yeah. All right. Have a good evening, folks.